name is Madison Newman. The title of my paper is All That Is Gold Does Not Glitter: The Consequences of Dwarven Greed in Tolkien's Legendarium. From Sauron's devastating desire to rule Middle-earth, to Gollum's all-consuming need for his precious, no sin is better represented in Tolkien's literary works than greed. Although many characters in Tolkien's Legendarium are burdened with the sin of greed and meet their demise because of it, no group is so greatly consumed and, likewise, so greatly suffers for its collective avarice than does the Dwarven race. In this paper, I will demonstrate the clarity with which Tolkien illustrates the problems of avarice by examining the connection between Dwarven greed and misfortune in Tolkien's writings. Part 1. Durin's Bane. In Appendix A of The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien provides a brief history of the Dwarven race that is fraught with disaster. One of the first and greatest disasters occurred because of the greed of King Durin VI. Under Durin's rule, the dwarves who lived in Moria, or Khazad-dûm, began to mine excessively in search of mithril, a priceless metal that Tolkien describes as the primary source of Moria's wealth. The dwarves were reckless in their lust for material wealth. In the process of mining, the dwarves accidentally released a Balrog, a monster of fire and darkness. The Balrog killed Durin VI and his son Nain I, as well as many other dwarves, leading to the abandonment of Moria and its treasures. Gandalf, in The Fellowship of the Ring, accurately analyzes the events, stating that even as mithril was the foundation of their wealth, so also was it their destruction. They delved too greedily and too deep, and disturbed that from which they fled, Durin's Bane. The dwarves were too greedy for mithril and were punished by Tolkien for it, leading directly to their loss of homes, fortunes, and lives. The dwarven lust for mithril did not spell disaster for the dwarves alone. In The Fellowship of the Ring, Legolas the Elf mentioned how the elves of Lothlorien suffered in the aftermath of the Balrog's awakening. In response, Gimli the dwarf argued that the dwarves did not create the evil creature, to which Legolas agreed, but remarked that the evil arrived as a result of the dwarves' actions. Most notably, Gandalf the Wizard met his end while facing the Balrog on the bridge of Khazad-dûm, which left the Fellowship without one of its most powerful characters for a short time. In their greed, the dwarves' careless actions unleashed a creature that would reign in terror for over 1,000 years. Part 2. Return to Moria. The tragedy of Moria did not end with the discovery of the Balrog. 800 years after the fall of Moria, the dwarven king, Thror, returned to reclaim Moria's lost fortunes. During the 800-year period, the dwarves had once again prospered and met with destruction because of it. Thror himself was living in poverty when he set his sights on Khazad-dûm. Rather than attempting to build a new life and earn a living wage, as his grandson Thorin and many other dwarves did, Thror set his sights on much greater wealth, Moria and its mithril. Thror traveled to Moria and was swiftly cut down by orcs that had taken residence there. If Thror had remained with Thorin and the other displaced dwarves, he could have built a life of moderate means and would not have found violence and ruin. Tolkien punishes Thror not for attempting to alleviate his poverty, but for seeking fortune beyond need. Once again, the pursuit of an overabundance of wealth led directly to the dwarves' destruction. 200 years after the death of Thror, a group of dwarves once again returned to Moria in search of wealth. Balin the dwarf led his company into Moria 30 years before the events of the Fellowship of the Ring. At this time, the dwarves were prospering in their home in Erebor. Nevertheless, some dwarves, such as Balin, were overcome with the desire to reclaim the wealth of their ancestors in Moria. The dwarves could have remained in Erebor and lived well, but instead gave themselves over to the greedy desire for treasures beyond what they had. This group of dwarves returned to Moria only to meet their ends at the hands of the orcs who once again resided in the Misty Mountains. 3 times the dwarves entered Moria with the hope of acquiring riches beyond measure, and 3 times Tolkien rewarded them with ruin. The relationship between Moria and the dwarves is a cautionary tale. Tolkien warns us that the path of greed is also the path of self-destruction. Part 3. The Desolation of Dragons. Moria was not the only site of dwarven misfortune. After fleeing the Balrog, the surviving dwarves went north and took up residence in Erebor and in the Grey Mountains. And in these 2 locations, the dwarves again invited disaster. After leaving Moria, Thrain, the dwarf, traveled to Erebor, the Lonely Mountain, where he became king and built a prosperous life for himself and his fellow dwarves. However, Thrain's son, Thorin I, was not content with the prosperity of Erebor. Thorin left the Lonely Mountain and instead sought the largely undiscovered bounty of the Grey Mountains, along with many other dwarves. The punishment for this pursuit of boundless wealth was administered by Tolkien to Thorin's descendants. As we have already seen with the Balrog and the orcs, Tolkien preferred to administer punishment to the dwarves in the form of monsters. To the dwarves in the north, Tolkien sent dragons. In Tolkien's Legendarium, dragons are greedy creatures who steal and hoard gold and jewels, despite having no use for them. Those characters who are greatly overcome with greed and desire are said to have the dragon sickness. In this way, dragons can be seen as the embodiments of greed. The riches of the Grey Mountains attracted the attention of the dragons, who attacked the dwarves, stealing their treasures and killing Thorin I's descendants, Dain I and Dain's son, Thror. Through the use of dragons, Tolkien demonstrates how those who covet leave themselves open to plundering and other disasters. Unfortunately for the dwarves, this message was not clearly received, and history was doomed to repeat itself. Another of Dain's sons, Thror, returned to Erebor after the destruction in the Grey Mountains, and it was here that a similar calamity to that in the Grey Mountains occurred. The dwarves prospered in Erebor to the point that they became immensely rich and famous, such that even the least prosperous dwarf had money to spend freely, and the halls of Erebor were filled with gold and jewels. Eventually, word of the dwarves' opulence spread, drawing the attention of a particularly wicked and greedy dragon named Smaug. Smaug laid waste to Erebor and its neighboring city of Dale, killing many dwarves and men, and taking the dwarven fortune for himself. Those dwarves who survived were left homeless and destitute. Tolkien's message here is clear. Greed attracts greed. The greed of the dwarves attracted the greed of Smaug, and all of his destruction. As with the dwarves in the Grey Mountains, the dwarves in Erebor built an excess of wealth that invited the greed of others, and with it, their doom. Part 4. The King Under the Mountain. Tolkien's thesis on the terrible nature of greed is made most explicit in his work, The Hobbit, or There and Back Again. A group of dwarves led by Thorin Oakenshield, grandson of Thror, journeyed to Erebor in order to take back the treasure that was stolen by Smaug, the dragon. To accomplish this, they enlisted a hobbit named Bilbo to act as their burglar. Tolkien characterizes the dwarves in The Hobbit as dominated by greed. Charles Nelson explains how Thorin and his company represent the three aspects of greed: covetousness, ingratitude, and robbery. The dwarves' covetousness is seen in the nature of their quest: to reclaim a treasure hoard. Until the events in The Hobbit, the dwarves lived comfortably in exile, but could not forget about their golden hoard that was lost in Erebor. Although the dwarves claimed that they sought revenge on Smaug, it is their treasure that primarily motivated them. This is evidenced in the song that the dwarves sang about Erebor and Smaug when they first met Bilbo, where they spoke of seeking long-forgotten gold. Nowhere in the song was it mentioned that the dwarves sought to punish Smaug for his misdeeds. Rather, the strongest desire in the hearts of the dwarves, the idea that they chose to immortalize in music, was the desire to have their lost gold returned to them. The dwarves, and especially Thorin's ingratitude and robbery, can be seen together in the events in the latter half of The Hobbit. The dwarves received assistance in their quest from the men of Lake Town. One man, Bard, was even responsible for killing Smaug and freeing the treasure of the Lonely Mountain. In response, Thorin orders the dwarves and hobbit to take control of the mountain before anyone else arrives. The men of Lake Town went to Erebor and requested assistance and repayment from the dwarves in the form of a small piece of the treasure that the dwarves now possessed. Despite previous promises to repay the men's kindness, Thorin was indignant and refused to share the dwarves' wealth. Thorin acted selfishly. His mind was full of lust for the riches in the mountain, and especially for the priceless Arkenstone gem. By the time that the orcs arrived on the doorstep of Erebor and the war began, Thorin appeared to be completely consumed by greed. He lashed out and physically assaulted former friends, threatened war with previous allies, and appeared in every way to have transformed from one of the story's protagonists to an antagonist. For this transgression, Tolkien punishes Thor and his cousins Fili and Kili with death at the hands of the orcs in the Battle of the Five Armies. Once again, the dwarves are struck down by disasters of their own making. If Thorin had not sought the long-lost gold of Erebor, then Thorin and his cousin dwarves could have continued to lead comfortable lives in exile. On his deathbed, Thorin had a change of heart, and it is here that Tolkien makes his opinion towards greed most clear. Thorin repented for his selfishness and greed, and admitted to Bilbo that if more of us valued food and cheer and song above hoarded gold, it would be a merrier world. This quote sheds light on why Tolkien would choose easily contented folk, such as the hobbits, to be his protagonists. Their desire for simple pleasures, such as food and cheer, make them the most resistant to greed. The dwarves, on the other hand, consistently choose wealth at the cost of their own happiness and the happiness of others. In Tolkien's opinion, material greed is a source of misfortune and unhappiness. He uses the dwarven race to illustrate his opinion. Repeatedly, the dwarves pursue riches beyond their needs and are struck down by calamities of which they themselves are the cause. Thank you.